On behalf of myself, Jordanian Arab students at the campus, we welcome His Royal Highness Prince Firas bin Raad today. We are honored to have him with us at BYU today. His Royal Highness is currently enrolled in Harvard School. Yes, and he holds MPH in Public Health from Harvard University, MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University, BA in Economics and Public Health from Johns Hopkins University also. He is a board member of King Hussein Foundation, National Council of Welfare of the Disabled Middle East Association for Management of Hearing Loss, Royal Subcommittee for Public Sector Reform, Jordan Swedish Medical Association, and several other prestigious affiliations. He has numerous publications. His Royal Highness will speak about 20 to 25 minutes, and then he will be happy to have any question from you to address lecture-related question as well as Jordan-U.S. relationship. Please join me to welcome Prince Firas today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and sorry for my raspy voice. I was saying earlier, if you think I sound like Marlon Brando, it's completely unintentional. And due to my daughters getting sick back home in Washington, D.C., and I must say, it's always risky talking after you've had a great meal here in Utah. And it reminds me of a quotation by Winston Churchill saying that speeches are easy to conceive but hard to deliver. And they're very much like babies in that way, and especially when you have a raspy voice. So please forgive me, and I would like to extend to all of you my wife's greetings. She had hoped to be here with me on this visit, our first visit to Utah, but unfortunately she could not make it. So we are planning a second visit, a return visit, sometime soon. And I must say, and I've repeated this over the course of this day, that I called my wife as soon as I landed yesterday and told her that I do indeed feel like I'm at home. Dr. Peterson was describing to me the different landmarks, saying we have a Jordan River here, we have Mount Nebo there, we have this there, and so it felt very much like home. I want to disappoint you by saying that I'm not going to talk about Middle East health initiatives. I did health this morning, and I think I'm going to talk a little bit about developmental challenges in our region as we see them from the World Bank, and maybe as I see them from our vantage point in Jordan. And then we can hopefully open it up for Q&A if you have any questions or thoughts. And what I'd like to do is just give you a quick snapshot of what I think the key developmental challenges are in our region, and then maybe speak briefly about some maybe of the countries that are doing the right things and where we can go. Let me start by, I think, a quote that I like, and you may recognize where it's from. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, and it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, and it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, and it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, and it was the winter of our despair. And I think in many ways that quotation can apply to the realities in our region and the things that we are facing now as countries collectively, but also individually within each country. The challenges are tremendous, and they're daunting. And I will begin, maybe before I touch on some of them, by telling you how diverse, and I'm sure you know how diverse our region is. The Middle East, as we characterize it at the World Bank, consists of about 18, 19 countries divided along different income levels. And I don't think you see that that great range of different income levels in other regions of the world. But you have, for example, the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries that have income levels of maybe $10,000 to $15,000 per capita and higher. Qatar has approached, $20,000 per capita. Close by, in the same peninsula, Yemen exists and has a per capita income of about $600. Djibouti, right across the water, is there as well, and it's a member of our Middle East and North Africa region, and it has a per capita of probably $600 to $700. So in terms of income levels, in terms of geographic sizes of different countries, Egypt, where Ahmed is from, boasts a population of about 65 million people, whereas Bahrain maybe has 600,000 people. In terms of economic structures and systems of governance, it is very varied across the region, from systems of republicanism to systems of monarchy to systems of outright rule. And so you see a region that is extremely diverse in outlook, in capability, and in economic growth. Just to touch quickly on the developmental challenges, I think I listed about 7 or 8, and then I thought to myself of this old joke, the good news and the bad news, and of a professor telling his children, well, these are the problems of the Middle East, and he would recite a whole litany, and then the student looked up and said to him, well, what is the good news? And he said, well, there's no more bad news. That's the good news. But we have a lot of challenges, and I think a few important things that are happening as well. And I'll begin with the most obvious challenge, and that's the one of conflict, war, and refugees. And we have, I think, 3 primary areas or zones of conflict, as you all know: West Bank, Gaza, Israel. That the struggle over Palestine between the Palestinians, Arabs, and the Israelis. We have the Iraq situation now, and we also have the problem of the Sudan and Darfur. And I think each one of these, you also have interstatal tensions between other countries of the Middle East, and hopefully some conflict prevention can happen before we have to talk about conflict resolution. But let me start with the Arab-Israeli divide. I think it's unfortunate that both communities politically now are heading in different historical trajectories. We were hoping during the 90s it would go like this, but now it seems like it's heading this way. And I think it's the responsibility of all players, particularly the big players, the Quartet, the U.S., Russia, European Union, and the regional actors. Egypt has a great role to play. We're trying to do our part in bringing the different parties together. But the Land for Peace formula is the only existing solution, and I hope that can be a negotiated one and not a unilateral move on the part of the Israelis. Because as the politicians try to figure it out, the people on the street are suffering. West Bank, Gaza, probably the poverty line, maybe 50% of the population are under the poverty line. And in terms of unemployment, 35 to 40% of the people are unemployed. And if any of you have visited Gaza and seen the refugee camps and the conditions, you will know what I mean. It's a tremendous sea of misery, and I hope things will move in a better direction. Iraq is I think the greatest challenge for U.S. foreign policy and for many states in the region. And if it destabilizes, it can have incredible effects on the Gulf area and more towards our area of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. And we hope that a government can be formed over the next few years, or few days rather, and a federal formula can be put in place so that the different minorities can govern the country in a federal way that makes sense. Much like you have here in the United States, we need a good federal system in Iraq that can respect the rights and desires and aspirations of the minorities, but yet retain a national outlook. I think that is incredibly important. And then the Sudan, I think it's heart-wrenching to think of the refugees. Different estimates have been made about the number of deaths. People do think now that maybe 2 million out of 7 million have left the area, and I think you're seeing an incredibly large number of deaths and disease and mortality. moving away a little bit from the conflict areas, we have a chronic problem of poverty in the region, and it's quite pervasive. And World Bank estimates put it at around 25%. So 25% of the population live under $2 per day or less. In terms of very high levels of poverty, and that is $1 per day or less, maybe 2 to 3% of our collective populations live at that level. But we still have a large chunk who are only averaging, up to $700-800 a year, and it's quite something, and needs to be worked on. And you see it particularly in the low-income countries of Yemen and Djibouti. In Yemen, 42% of the population lives under the poverty line. And even within countries that are high income, like some of the high income oil-rich countries of the GCC, Saudi Arabia, there's a great disparity of the well-off and the lesser-off. And today in my talk on public health, I showed some of the difference in outcomes, health outcomes, and how they vary across income. And it's quite starking, quite marked, the level and rate of disparity between the different income quintiles in any population. That leads me to the issue of youth and job creation and pension reform, because if you have these levels of poverty, you can only do it one way. And to get out of the poverty, you have to grow your economies, and you have to create jobs for your youth, because through private sector development, I think that's the only way that we can sustain economic growth rates that put you higher or above the population growth rates. And we are facing, I think, two phenomena in the Middle East. One is just of absolute population growth. We've had high fertility rates historically, so you have very large numbers of people entering the workforce. And it's estimated that about 80 to 100 million new jobs will have to be created before 2020. So over the next 15 years, about 80 to 100 million jobs will have to be created by the governments and the businesses of the region. And if the public sectors don't allow the energies and the creativity of the private sector to flow, it'll be very hard to actually create those jobs. And it could lead two ways. Either you have these large numbers entering the workforce and they can't find any jobs. That would lead to social distress, social unrest, and eventually migration. Or if they're able to figure out how to create the incentives for job creation, then you can see a big boost in per capita income growth rates. And that's what we're hoping. Will happen. There will be a demographic dividend rather than a demographic time bomb, because it is usually the poor urban youth who lean towards forms of extremism and religious zealotry. And if you have very high levels of unemployment, it can be quite destabilizing, I think. And we've seen that only recently, a phenomenon in France, all across France and Paris. It's the youth who don't believe that they have a stake in the system. The next maybe area, and I think I'll wrap health and education, human development reforms within that context of job creation. I made a plug for health sector reform this morning in saying that health reform has to be put on the developmental agenda. And I think you can only push your economies forward if you have a workforce that is healthy and is educated and is highly skilled. And we need to do more with our health systems and health outcomes in the region. We have lots of gaps in terms of coverage, and those gaps don't allow for access to health services, which in turn negatively affects economic productivity. Another great challenge is, and as you probably already know, water is a huge issue in our region. We're one of the most water scarce regions in the world. I think about 5%, this is one statistic that I know, 5% of the world's population lives in our region in the Middle East, North Africa, but we only have 1% of the world's renewable water resources. And our per capita supply now in 2005 is about 30% less than what it was about 30 years ago. And you will see that water is going to be driving a lot of policies, and it will govern sort of relationships between the states of the region. And in fact, an argument was made in 1982 when the Israelis crossed the Lebanese border to go into Lebanon and up to Beirut. One of the big reasons was that they apparently wanted to control the water supplies of the Litani River, and this was made subsequently as an argument. But water is going to be a problem internally, but also can lead to conflict and tension interstatally, and that needs to be looked at. And these challenges that I am mentioning are part and parcel of the regional strategy of the World Bank. They're sort of 5 priority areas. One is public sector reform, one is private sector development, the other is water, education, and gender. And these are sort of the 5 pillars of our strategy. And I'll touch a little bit upon gender. I think this is a remarkably important issue for our region from a variety of perspectives. We have one of the highest illiteracy rates amongst women in the world. It's estimated that 45% of the women, the females in the MENA region, are illiterate. And there are efforts to actually reverse this. But when you have, almost half of your labor force illiterate, it's very difficult to push economic growth forward. And even in countries where you have high educational participation rates, a lot of that educational attainment is not reflected in labor force participation rates. And I know that in our own country of Jordan, where you have very high enrollment rates, but when you go to see, well, where did these graduates go? And many of them don't enter the workforce for a number of reasons that should be addressed. Another issue which has really been in the limelight is systems of governance and accountability, and this is one area where we have to do a lot of work on to ensure that we have inclusive political participation, inclusive development, making sure that everybody's counted, everybody's is heard, and there is transparency in the public systems. And at the World Bank, we more recently now under our new president have looked at this more seriously and have unveiled the anti-corruption strategy. And it's going to be a bit difficult to figure out what the developmental paradigm will be and how we apply it across different countries, because it may become politicized at the end of the day, because, do you apply a corruption rule to country A the same way you do to country B versus country C? But surely it's a big issue now that deserves attention, because I think it does affect development and can impede growth. So we do have a deficit in terms of inclusive development, governance, and democracy, and I think the peoples of the region will be demanding more from their leaderships. The last issue, which sort of is a result of many of the others that I've mentioned, is the challenge of religious extremism, of zealotry, of fanaticism, and it's a challenge that we must face, the peoples of the region, and to really try to push the moderate agenda within our countries for interfaith dialogue to take root, but also within our own religions, within the religion of Islam, for there to be greater dialogue, a greater discussion, a greater sense of opening, and I think a lighter sense of faith. There is this I don't want to see light sense, but there's a darkness of faith that unfortunately has pervaded many of our different minorities. And there are minority groups that are taking advantage of the socioeconomic ills of some of the populace and trying to push the religious agenda ahead in a negative way. And we would like to try to reverse that and push it along in a positive way. And I was saying today earlier in Jordan, we've tried to do our part in making sure that the agenda of the middle ground is kept, maintained, and promoted, because it's all, fair and well to say, okay, we hear what the radicals are saying, but what are the moderates doing about it? And we need the moderates to come together and to be vocal. And in Jordan, we've tried to establish different institutions that would push that agenda, to really emphasize our common humanity and to emphasize what brings us together rather than what divides us. So in a very quick sort of snapshot, these are sort of some of the developmental challenges that I think afflict our region, or our region faces, and we need to be doing much more with regard to them. Now, some good news stories. I don't want you to come away from this lecture thinking it's all bad news. There are daunting challenges, and you can't shy away from those challenges, and the only way you can really effectively deal with them is if you acknowledge them. And in our region, there's been a bit of denial, and I think a more sober look at the issues is required for us to move forward. There are signs of progress. I think certain bright spots within the countries of the region. Certainly, travelers who go to the UAE and see what Dubai has been able to accomplish, it is remarkable. I went there for the first time 2 years ago, and you feel like you're in a mix of Disneyland, Singapore, and Miami Beach, and not that maybe that's good, but the sense of development is quite incredible. The accomplishments are great, and there is a private sector, there is rule of law to enforce private contracts. Where they could be doing things better maybe is inclusive development, political participation, getting systems of governance in place. But there's no doubt that they've done a phenomenal job. Oman is another country that I'm very familiar with, and even though the political participation process is taking its time, it is a great country of a leader who has been able to do great things for his people. Sultan Qaboos, who took over from his father, has really moved this country from third world almost into first world, and Oman was able to drop its mortality rate, its infant mortality rate, I think over the last 20 to 25 years, faster than any country in the world. And it's a great tribute to the Omani development paradigm and their accomplishments in the health sector. I think Tunisia has been doing very, very well. Economically, it is socially advanced, but again, there are more things that could be done at the political level to ensure the participation of broad segments of society. These are some of the bright spots. I didn't want to include my own country, so it would smack of PR. But I think these three countries are ones that have been doing good things, and there are others as well. And at this moment, I'd like to stop here to open it up for any questions, observations, queries, or gossip. I'll leave it to you.
There's a little bit of logistics we need to tell you. First, let us thank His Highness for speaking to us today. And we need to thank the Arabic Club for making this possible, and we're grateful that you've done this. Now, here's the trick. We have one microphone that Hala will have, and we ask when you give a question that you speak in the mic, because this is being recorded and it will be available on the Kennedy Center website, and we won't be able to hear the question unless you speak into the microphone. The other thing that we need to tell you, Your Highness, these are supposed to all be students, serious students, and their next class starts at 4 o'clock. And so If you see them start trickling out about 5 or 10 minutes to 4, it's not that they're trying to be rude, at least I hope not. They're trying to go off to class.
Sure.
Okay.
Ahlan wa sahlan.
Yeah.
Economically and educationally, is the Kingdom of Jordan right now allowing Palestinian refugees from the West Bank in to go to school or to get jobs or to get visas? Is that part of the policy right now?
Well, historically, I think no other country has sacrificed as much or served the Palestinians over the many years than Jordan. We have tried to include most of the Jordanians of Palestinian origin in all spheres of life, and I think we've done a great number of things to assure that all of the civil rights are there. There are now issues as to, how many more we can absorb, how many more can come in. And this issue in particular is very politicized. And I remember back in 94, 95, after the Wadi Araba agreement, I was, working in the Ministry of Health, and we had thought of different sort of scenarios for the return of refugees from the camps to Palestine. And obviously, not all of them would return. Some would remain in Jordan. The United Nations Relief and Work Agency would then pack its bags and leave, and the Ministry of Health would have to assume its responsibilities towards these citizens. But even talking about that back then was highly politicized, because you have people on the right and you have people on the left who are against this. And you have people on the right on religious grounds saying, we don't want to encourage the transfer of Palestinians from the West Bank or Palestine to Jordan. That would only fulfill, the ambitions of Prime Minister Sharon and the Likud. And you had people on the left who would be saying the same thing. But then yet you had Jordanians of Palestinian origin who would face problems in terms of access sometimes. And that is problematic. And I think, now it's an issue, where some Jordanians of Palestinian origin want full demographic representation and political representation based on those demographics. But that is being, encountered by fierce opposition by both the left and the right in both the East Bank and West Bank communities. And so it's a difficult position that Jordan finds itself in right now. But I think if there is a comprehensive peace settlement and everything becomes clearer as to, okay, well, I will return as a Palestinian, or I will reside in Jordan and become, a Jordanian citizen and enjoy all of the rights given to me by the Constitution. And so I think in that context things will be much clearer. But still, the whole issue is very politicized.
Yes, I'm interested in the type of economic growth that you're planning with manufacturing jobs dropping worldwide. What do you see as being the engine of that growth, and is population growth reduction part of that, one of those factors that you're looking at as well?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think we can see a demographic dividend if we create the jobs, and I think the government has been intent on liberalizing the economy to the extent possible, bringing down trade barriers, encouraging exports to North America and Europe. And the free trade agreement that we signed with the United States has been incredibly beneficial to our country. I think exports went from something like 250 million to over $1 billion because of the free trade agreement with the United States. And this, I think, is still custom free and quota free. Our goods can come into the country without those restrictions. So a lot of our growth now is premised on exports in different sectors, textiles, drugs, and so forth. We have been seeing a lot of activity, not lately, but tourism has really been one of the mainstay of our economies. And you also have had a lot of the remittances historically. They have supported a lot of the consumption locally, and a lot of our educational policies have tended to help export our human resources, which is good and bad. It leads to a brain drain, but then you see the economic benefit in terms of remittances coming back to Jordan. But I think His Majesty has a vision for the country where we can move in a direction where the energies and the creativity of the private sector can be unleashed. The rivers of creativity, that if you give people the tools and you give them the opportunities, that they can push your country forward. And we're seeing this more and more in the different sectors. IT is one big sector that has received a lot of attention, and we're hoping that this will create a lot of jobs and ripple down into the other sectors. But having said that, we still, despite our economic growth rates, which have been impressive, we still have sizable issues of poverty and unemployment, and we have to make sure that the benefits of that growth are redistributed to the disadvantaged, and that's a big challenge.
It is interesting when you say that about the brain drain. I spend a lot of time in Jordan, and at the University of Jordan in the Faculty of Nursing, 70% of the nursing students there are male. And the minute they graduate, they go right to the Gulf states, leaving Jordan in a constant shortage of nurses. And yet the income that they send home is very valuable. So it's that catch-22. You need the economic resources that they can provide. However, the healthcare system is suffering greatly because of that. And I see that repeatedly in numerous activities in Jordan, that is just that catch-22. How do you move forward at a rapid pace? Because Jordan doesn't have time enough to take all of the time that it took somebody else to develop. They've got to move from square one to square 10 and miss all of the ones in between. So you need the economics, but you also need the brain power in Jordan. And I wondered, can you see a way that we can fix that?
Yeah, it's a huge issue that all countries are struggling with, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where you see whole health systems devoid of human resources. And people are saying, like in Mali, the majority of Mali physicians are in London and not in Mali, and there are more Mali physicians in the UK than the country of Mali. And that's very much the same picture across a lot of the sub-Saharan African countries, and it's hard to meet the challenges of, for example, the Millennium Development Goals without having your systems in place to provide services. You can throw a lot of money at different diseases, at different issues, but if you don't have your human resources there to deliver them, you really can't get very far. In Jordan, it's a big problem, and there are no easy solutions. We've focused, actually today we had a discussion on general practitioners, family physicians in Jordan, and to push primary health care and health promotion at the community level and the family levels, you need very good GPs and a large amount of GPs. But the problem is that there's no glamour in being a general practitioner, and there's no special recognition, and the financial rewards aren't great. So I think it's up to the government to try to structure the system of incentives so that you have more people going into these areas. And I think people are motivated by two things. One are sort of inner convictions, and one are external financial incentives. And it's the combination of both. You really need both to get an effective system in place. But when you have neighboring Gulf countries that are paying 4 or 5 times what your nurses or physicians are getting, it's very hard to tell them, look, sacrifice. And that's why I think we need public sector reform. We need civil service reform, so you can get a small but very professional government, a civil service that is highly paid, highly educated, and can provide services. Which reminds me of a quote by Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew but is still around. He's the senior minister of the Singaporean government, and he was really responsible for the historical development of the country. And he said, when I was Prime Minister of Singapore, he was the highest paid Prime Minister in the world in terms of a salary level. And he was giving this lecture. He said, I was the highest paid, but I was the poorest. Which means, if you pay people well, they will not go and look around for external ways to generate resources for themselves. So that's another issue that should be looked at.
Hi. Does World Bank or UN support Jordan in order to improve the quality of life in refugee camps that are Palestinians? If they do, what kind of help do they provide?
Not recently. I don't think recently. We had a health project that closed in 2003, and that was designed in 1997, and it was looking at the big national healthcare systems in place and thinking about health insurance reforms, reforms in the health management information systems of the providers. But we have Jordan as a country has been a supporter of the UN Relief and Works Agency, and which has relied primarily on donations from the member communities and the large donors. But it's quite tragic to see the circumstances of a lot of the refugees in the population camps. And we have in the refugee camps, we have different centers around the kingdom that service the refugee populations in addition to the UNRWA centers. But primarily it's the UN that has been providing the primary and the public health services to the refugee populations. And then the Ministry of Health plays the role of the insurer of last resort. So that's where we are at the moment.
What were some of the effects on the Jordanian economy during the UN sanctions against Iraq back in the 1990s? And what is your opinion of those UN sanctions?
Well, they didn't work. I think to the extent that they were motivated to replace the regime or to get the regime to reverse its course. And this is very important in the context of Syria or Iran or so on, or countries that the U.S. and Europe are thinking of slapping sanctions on. If you punish a population, it can lead to consequences that you don't anticipate, and those populations aren't really responsible many a time for the actions of their governments. I think if I remember back to the sanctions period, I think at one level, obviously the trade that was ongoing between Iraq and Jordan in many ways was prohibited or impeded. There was the oil for food program, which I think Jordanian companies participated in. But during the 1980s, there was a lot of trade, and our seaport in Aqaba was very busy. So it did have, I think, some effect. And in fact, I think there were many studies written on this issue. And if you send me an email, I can give you the citations of the studies that looked at the economic effects of the sanctions.
You had talked about the very positive effect of the free trade agreement between the United States and Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
What other countries outside the Middle Eastern and North African region have had particularly beneficial relationships to the Middle East, for the Middle East?
I think the European countries are very engaged, and they've provided lots of aid, I think much more now than the World Bank is giving. So the two big donors have been the EU and the American population. In addition to the Japanese. The Japanese more and more are giving away money and giving loans. And Jordan, I think, is the highest per capita recipient of Japanese aid outside of Southeast Asia. So they're providing assistance, but really I think it boils down to the EU and the United States. Canada, I should say, is playing more of a role, and I am personally involved in a Canadian organization, an outfit that is pushing peace-building activities between Arabs, Israelis, Jordanians, Palestinians, and Israelis. And they've tried to play a very even-handed, constructive role in the region. So I think they're different players, but I think primarily the U.S. and EU really drive the donor community and its activities.
Recently, since 9/11 until now, it seems that the Western public opinion of Islam has continued to become more negative. And I was looking at some of the reasons for that as being more Islamic terrorist attacks against Muslims. For example, the attacks in Amman, the hotel bombings, or in Iraq or Pakistan this week. What is your opinion of this situation where Muslims are attacking Muslims, and how does that affect the public opinion in Jordan of Muslims and in the Middle East in general, and how do you think that can affect the eventual possibility of a solution to conflict between the Middle East and the West?
Well, let me begin with your last point. I don't believe in the premise. I don't think there is a conflict between East and West. I think you have internal problems within countries that are then projected out to the external world. And the issue of religious zealotry, I think, has many different drivers. One is development, surely. When you have people suffering from socioeconomic ills, they can be motivated to move in ways that aren't very enlightened and beneficial. And so I think you have poverty playing a big role, economic poverty, and people not feeling that they have a stake in the system. But you also have not economic poverty, but ideological poverty, the poverty of the mind. And you see this. I mean, you look at the 9/11 hijackers. Most of them were from high-income families. And so socioeconomic, explanations are part of it. The other, part are the ideologies that are bandied about and promoted by certain groups of people. And it's a challenge for Muslims who believe in the moderate message of Islam to try to counter that. And I think the states and the communities and the regional organizations, and more recently in Amman in particular, I think as part of the Organization of Islamic Conference, tried to issue a declaration where more than, I think, 800 to 900 Islamic clerics came together and tried to come together to lay out a platform and announced their rejection of any type of violence that is motivated for certain reasons. So I think more and more you will see these types of movements by the moderates who are trying to reclaim the middle ground and to reclaim their faith. And I think this is an internal issue that the West really can't do much about. I don't think the U.S. or Europe or other players can do much about, but it's an internal issue that we in the region have to deal with and have to be more proactive at.
I have a question. One of my classes.
I can't see you. Oh, there we go.
I'm too short. I'm sorry. One of the questions. In one of my classes, I'm writing a paper about international organization and its influence on development in the world in general, and if they really do have any influence economically, politically, health-wise. And my concern is, by joining the international organizations, the Middle Eastern countries like the WTO and being part of the World Bank, did this really help any economical benefits? Did the poverty rate drop? Did any political reform happen? Maybe not significantly, but slightly.
Yeah. I would, ask myself the same question. And in fact, I do every day, wondering whether we are really making an impact on the margin by the work that we do in international organizations. And sometimes, you take to heart the positive impact that you can have. But ultimately it boils down to the stakeholders themselves in the region, the governments, the states and societies. I think the international organizations, be them, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization, the EU, different players, can have an important effect in shaping the debate and shaping the different issues. And I think over the years we've brought a lot of knowledge and some cheap money, which has been good. The combination of cheap money, which they wouldn't otherwise have access to, and knowledge has been able to push reforms in the different sectors. And the bank has moved, I think, in great directions to think of development as multifaceted. And previously, it was the old sort of macroeconomic view and of getting the private sector going and not thinking about the fundamental building blocks like health reform, educational reform, pension reform, and so on. So I think I think we've had an impact, but it's been marginal in many countries, and primarily because policies are driven many a time not by the data, not by policy advice, but by other considerations, and it's difficult. I personally work in Lebanon, and it's a very difficult policy environment to work in, but we have seen great results. Like one thing we have been working on, and finally it did take root, was the drop in pharmaceutical prices. Lebanon and the Lebanese public were paying some of the highest prices for drugs, even higher than the U.S. And it was because of certain economic reasons, sort of cartel behavior by the importers. And we were able to help the Ministry of Health come up with a pricing scheme where they dropped some of the prices of the drugs by 30 to 40%, which has a huge impact on the poor. Because usually the poor pay out of pocket. There aren't any insurance systems there. So we have had some impact, but not as much as we hope we could.
Your Highness, is your country as concerned as the U.S. is with the situation in Iran? And if so, how are you dealing with that now, or what do you intend to do in the future if the situation was to become worse than what it is right now as far as the diplomatic situation is?
Okay. Well, please don't think I speak on behalf of my government. I don't. What you hear here is personal opinion. But it's naturally a concern, the way things are evolving, the statements that are being issued, sort of the geopolitical dance between Tehran and Tel Aviv. It is worrisome, and you don't want things to escalate beyond which you really can't bring them under control. And you hear different things from different people. You hear people in or close to Iran saying that the military in particular have a different view than the civilians who are in charge, and they have a much more sober view of the possibilities and what will happen in the event of conflict. So I hope we're not heading down down the road to conflict and a collision course between the U.S. and Iran. But certainly we hope that cooler heads prevail. And we used to say we were stuck between Iraq and a hard place, and we don't want to be stuck between Iran and a hard place. So I hope that doesn't happen. Okay, well, I see most of you are getting restless.
This is going to be the last question, actually.
Okay. Of course, the whole world mourned for your country's loss during the September terrorist attacks. I was wondering what the Jordanian government is doing to, besides some of the measures you previously said, to increase safety and security in the capital city of Amman.
I think we've been doing much more than before. I think people who have been to Amman more recently than I have can state quite categorically that a lot of the public places, the hotels, the restaurants, and so forth, the measures there are much more stringent than before. And I think we were going along very peacefully and idyllically, thinking that we would not be touched and tainted. And we had a belief in our intelligence services and so on. But I think we became too complacent. And now, obviously, the pendulum after the attack swung in the opposite direction, and there was a clampdown. And now I hope that it, swings back a little bit. But I think more or less the country is very safe. But I think people who go there, and I was speaking to students from BYU who are going to Jordan over the summer, I think they'll have a tremendous time. And you just have to be careful which environments you go to and in which at what times. But I think in general it's very safe. Okay, well, thank you, all of you.